chapter has lots of information and several subtopics. International organization, then international law, which is again separate subdiscipline within international relations, international law, then human rights. These different smaller topics are treated in one chapter. But mainly, this chapter discusses mainly the UN, international organization. Then at the end, a little bit of human rights and international law. So today probably we'll cover mostly the UN and international organization. Then Friday, the rest of chapter 7. This chapter begins with roles of international organizations. Roles of international organizations. Then go back to our conceptual theoretical discussions about liberalism and realism. Then this author's philosophy about international relations are shown here in this chapter. His basic approach to international relations is that his philosophy is that realist perspectives are understandable, right? And there's a dilemma. There's a little bit of dilemma. There's a little bit of security dilemma. But states, they work together. In most cases, states work together. Okay? This is his basic approach to international relations. There is nothing that prohibits cooperation among states in and of itself, right? States work with other states, but in order for states to work with other states, there are some conditions. There are some conditions. So here, he discusses some important conceptual discussions about how cooperation occurs. What makes states cooperate? Okay? What makes states work together with other states? What is needed? What is needed to make states to work with other states? This is the most important question in these couple of pages. What is needed to make states work together with other states? I think he talks about three things. Three things are needed to make states work together with other states. Number one, rules. According to him, rules come first. But rules are not alone important. Rules are embedded in norms. Rules are embedded in norms. There are rules, and rules are based upon norms, but these are not sufficient conditions. One more. Okay? These rules, norms, evolve, grow into institutions. To him, institutions are most safest mechanism for cooperation among states. Sometimes norms are shaky. Norms are shaky. norms are subject to manipulations by great powers. Without norms, rules do not even exist. First norms, then rules, then if these rules and norms grow into institutions, then I think that's a sufficient condition for cooperation. So these rules govern state behavior, right? Rules govern state behaviors. And when the rules become firmly established, then institutions grow around them. Then states develop the habit of working through these institutions. So cooperation is kind of a habit. Cooperation is kind of a habit. It's a habit. Rules are firmly established when these rules are repeated, right? When these rules are repeated, then become firmly established. So repetition is important. Repetition is important. Habit is important. Habit is important. Okay? And this is how state behaviors are governed, right? This is how states subject themselves to, external rules. Then he criticizes constructivist paradigm. Constructivist paradigm. From realist perspective, constructivist perspectives based on norms are shaky because, like I said, norms are particularly not sufficient to solve international problems, particularly in times of change. In times of change. Powers, strong powers, okay? They change norms. They manipulate norms. This is the weaknesses of constructivism, okay? Morality, norms are very much subjective. It depends on how you interpret them. Right? This is how great powers manipulate, right? Norms and morality. So institutions are important in that respect. Institutions are important. And in recent decades, institutions proliferated. Fortunately, luckily, in recent decades in international relations, institutions have expanded. What institutions? Institutions equals international organizations. Right? International organizations have proliferated in recent decades. So, just seeing this, international relations going in the right direction, because we have many, institutions around us, international organizations. Then he moves on to distinguish between, there are different types of international organizations. There are different types of international organizations. International governmental organizations, international governmental organizations, then non-governmental organizations, international non-governmental organizations, IGOs and NGOs. What's the best example of IGOs? The best example is the United Nations, the UN. The best example of international non-governmental organizations is International Committee of the Red Cross. Best example of international non-governmental organizations. Here's the number. How much international organizations have multiplied since 1945. The number of international organizations has grown more than 5 times. So today, international governmental organizations, more than 400. There are 400 of them. There are 400 international governmental organizations. NGOs, much more than that, tens of thousands. So this is shown in the figure 71. Okay? So the number of international governmental organizations began to exceed the number of states, the number of governments. I don't think so. What are other regional IGOs you could think of? There are many, right?
Yeah.
Besides EU, there are many more. Like for instance, from, let's say, from the Asia Pacific region. What's the Asia Pacific equivalent of intergovernmental organization here? EU is a European intergovernmental organization. What is Asian intergovernmental organization? Or Asia Pacific? APEC? APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Council. And ASEAN, which is Southeast Asian, intergovernmental organization. From the former Soviet Republic, CIS.
And between Argentina, Brazil, there is also conglomerate there.
From the Latin American region.
Yeah,
from the Latin American region, what is it called?
I just forget the name.
Mercosur.
Yeah.
Mercosur.
Yeah.
Okay, Mercosur. Right. Then the African region, the African Union. The African Union. What's the best example of global IGOs? Easy one. Easy one. What global IGOs? Besides the United Nations? The OPEC. Okay? Do you know the full name of the OPEC? Okay, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Interset, organization of governments and private businesses that operate communications. in terms of performance, who is doing better? Who has been doing better? Regional IGOs, global IGOs. Regional IGOs are much more cohesive, okay? Much more cohesive, and there are tangible outcomes from these regional IGOs rather than global IGOs. Global IGOs, in terms of performance, probably they address much too bigger questions. Okay, in that sense, less cohesive. Another way of distinguishing IGOs, okay, another criteria. Besides regional versus global, how do we, Kim Min-gi, how do we classify IGOs? Different criteria. Okay, more narrowly defined functional IGOs. Okay, functional IGOs that address particular problems. Okay, then broadly defined IGOs. NGOs, no doubt, NGOs tend to be much more functional oriented than intergovernmental organizations. The biggest NGOs, religious groups. Religious groups are the biggest among the largest NGOs. Now, then we get to the United Nations. Okay, the most important intergovernmental organization, the United Nations. 윤재상, according to this textbook, United Nations, the UN, has two faces. What does he mean by that? The UN seems to have two faces. What does he mean by that? He doesn't say directly, the UN has two faces, but indirectly he indicates that the United Nations is strong, but at the same time weak. What does he mean by that? I can begin with this. The UN, let me read this to you. The UN and other international organizations have both strengths and weaknesses in the anarchic international system. I like this statement. The UN in the anarchic international system. By nature, international system is anarchic, right? But then we have to find roles for the United Nations in the anarchic international system. What are the roles for the United Nations? As an intergovernmental organization, in a system where anarchy prevails? That's the question. That's where the role of United Nations is very much mixed, ambiguous. Because if you define the international system as an anarchic system, right, there must be no role for the United Nations. Right? So what kind of roles could we assign to intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations in the current international system? It's a kind of irony. It's a kind of irony because, here, let me read this to you. State sovereignty creates a real need for such organizations. This is very paradoxical. Very paradoxical. States, they claim sovereignty, independence. Right? States claim independence. They want to be free in their behavior. No doubt, they want to be free. But they want to create. They see a real need for international organizations such as the United Nations. What a paradox. States want sovereignty, but at the same time, they want to give up on it. Some of the sovereignty, they want to give up on it. That's how the United Nations was created. So the United Nations was created on a practical level. Practical level. States find some practical needs for international organizations, such as the United Nations. Practical need. Because they want some institutions to coordinate behaviors of states, state behaviors. However, state sovereignty severely limits the power of the United Nations. So this is how United Nations is sandwiched. States sees the need, but they don't want to delegate much power to the UN. So that's why they create it on a practical basis. So that's why the UN has had a mixed record with both strengths and weaknesses. So the United Nations has very limited power and resources. They don't have money. The UN doesn't have money. They don't have power. Okay? Yet the world places great hopes for the UN. Because national governments, they cannot solve many problems on their own. Because the UN is the closest thing to a world government. It's not a world government, right? It's not a world government. So states have created the United Nations to serve their needs. It's not the other way around. It's not the other way around. States created. Now, let's look at how the UN is structured, right? Some rationale for the UN, I think we covered some rationale. Purpose of the United Nations. Then, given this purpose, then how is the UN structured organizationally? Yunchoro, can you give us a summary of how the United Nations is structured, organized? How is the UN organized?
Basically, there's a General Assembly, the Security Council, and so Secretary General. And basically, underneath them there are keeping forces, Economic and Social Council, and all these agencies that basically work for the.
Okay. I think in terms of, to look at the structure, to see how the UN is structured, we first think about the main functions of the United Nations, main pillars of the United Nations. I think the United Nations have basically two important pillars. One is international peace and security. This is how this textbook is structured also. International peace and security. This is one function the United Nations should fulfill. International peace and security. Then the other one, international economic development. Okay, like issues facing poor countries. How do we help poor countries develop economically, socially, economically? So social economic development pillar, this second pillar. So there are these two pillars. So then, in terms of structure, I think the office that takes care of peace and security issues are which one? Security Council. Security Council takes care of peace and security issues, right? Most important office, Security Council. And their main job is to handle peace and security issues, military peace and security issues. That's Security Council. So this is most important office within the UN. And the other pillar, the other office in parallel, the other office is General Assembly. Okay, so Security Council versus General Assembly. General Assembly, their main task is to take care of social economic development issues. That's the main task of General Assembly. Okay, although looked from outside, the way it is structured, General Assembly looks like Congress at a national level, right? Whereas Security Council is like a cabinet, right? But in a sense, General Assembly, yes, sort of a Congress at a national level. Okay, because General Assembly passes budgetary issues. They have budgetary power. Okay, but it is also divided according to functions. Then you have Judiciary Branch. World Court. Again in parallel. Right? So you have Security Council, General Assembly, World Court. These are most important 3 offices within the United Nations. Then above these 3 offices, you have Secretariat. Secretariat. Secretariat is the admin office of the United Nations. Secretariat is the admin office. Secretariat is led by General Secretary of the United Nations. So technically, he's the head of the UN. At the same time, he leads Secretariat. One office was removed, outlived its usefulness, right? Trusteeship Council. Trusteeship Council. Their main job was to oversee the transition of formerly colonial countries to independence. But they no longer exist. Sometimes I think of my role as like an actor in this classroom, because actor, their role is to first they get the script, right, for some drama, then they act based on that script. Right? They make this written script alive. Right? And we all have this script, which is dead. Right? But I interpret these scripts, then make them alive. That's my role. Isn't it? Right. That's my role. So, I'm not just reading it, right? At least I want to make you, help you understand better by putting my own interpretations and making them alive with all kinds of different examples. Lively examples sometimes. Then asking questions, that's important. Asking questions. This helps, asking questions. And this is how the UN is structured, right? Makes sense. It's like a national governmental structure. You have government, cabinet, then you have Congress, right, which has budgetary power. Then you have Judiciary Branch. It's almost similar type of structure we have here at the global level. So that's why it is called like a semi-world government. Right? This is a semi-world government. Now, next thing I want to cover is the difference between the League of Nations. The difference between the League of Nations and the UN. What's the difference? The UN made a huge difference in terms of revising the past dysfunctional League of Nations. Right? Then what are new features? What are new features of the UN? What are good things about the UN as opposed to the League of Nations? Right? There are new features. There are new features. 이준구, what are the new features of the UN as opposed to the League of Nations, which made the UN much more efficient, much more powerful than the League of Nations. There are several essential features of the UN as opposed to the League of Nations.
For one thing, the United States joined the UN.
Okay, the US as a member state, yes, but more broadly, this textbook states that a major strength of the UN structure is the universality of its membership. Universality of its membership. This is the strength, major strength, compared to the League of Nations. So, as of 2011, there were 193 member states, including the US, obviously, no doubt. Including the United States, there were 193 member states. Just about every state. The exception was in Switzerland, but Switzerland also joined 2003. Okay, good thing. Major powers was made member states. Very important, right? Which was lacking. Which was one of the major reasons behind the failure of the League of Nations. What is the second feature? Second important feature that made the UN much more efficient, powerful. 임건. Where is it? The League of Nations. One of the reasons why the League of Nations failed was that they failed to deter aggression. As a collective security organization. Meanwhile, the UN had collective security enforcement mechanism. The UN has collective security enforcement mechanism. Where is it stipulated, this collective security enforcement? The UN? Chapter 7. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter authorizes the Security Council to use military force against aggression, international aggression. Although it depends on how you interpret that aggression, right? That is subject to many different, right, interpretations. So chapter 7 stipulation. So the UN was a collective security organization, not only on paper, not only in name. Real collective security organization. That's the difference. Now, then let's look at how the UN evolved over the last several decades, right? Whether or not the UN lived up to its name as a collective security organization, how the UN evolved over time. the UN has had a topsy-turvy, right, decades of history. The influence of the UN went up and went down, right? And there were good times but bad times. Right? The difference between the UN during the Cold War, the UN after the Cold War, right? What's the difference? What's the difference between the UN under US-Soviet bilateral conflicts and the United Nations after the collapse of the Soviet Union under the unilateral US power? Must be different, right? The roles of the United Nations must be different during the Cold War, after the Cold War, right? So let's look at that. Broadly speaking, during the Cold War, the UN like a 50s, 60s, 50s and 60s, the United Nations, these were the times of membership expansion. 50s, 60s, membership growth. Many more countries joined the United Nations as new member states. So membership expansion occurred during the 50s and 60s. Now, 홍정환. So there were many more new members joined the United Nations. 1970s and 80s. What happened after new members joined the United Nations? The internal dynamics of the United Nations began to change as many more members joined the United Nations. What new dynamics within the United Nations after new members joined the United Nations?
In the 70s, China joined.
Yes, 1971, China became a new member. That's a huge change. That's a huge change because China is not just one member. China was made one of permanent Security Council members. So it made a huge difference. That's one, yes. I mean, China as a new member, that's a huge change. Yes, what else? Let me ask you this. 광래요. Like we have two main bodies, main offices of the United Nations: General Assembly, one hand, and Security Council. In your opinion, during the Cold War, which office figured more prominently? Was it General Assembly or Security Council? So during the Cold War, Security Council figured much more prominently than the General Assembly? The other way around? Why is it so?
Because the US-Soviet conflict prevented consensus.
US-Soviet conflicts prevented consensus within the Security Council. Okay? So probably what you meant by that is that the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, mostly military, security conflict, this two superpower conflict was so intense that there was almost no room for maneuvering inside the Security Council. Okay? So that the global affairs at that time during the Cold War, at least at the United Nations level, global affairs focused much more on economic, social development issues in the context of the General Assembly. Is that what you're trying to say? Yes. So General Assembly figured much more prominently at the United Nations level. So Security Council was much more suppressed due to two superpower conflicts. Two superpowers didn't delegate security issues to the United Nations. These two powers, US, the Soviet Union, they solved between themselves security military issues, not at the United Nations, only between them. So the role of Security Council at that time as a security organization was much more invisible. So the role of the General Assembly was much more visible. I think this author says, in general, the UN in general, during the Cold War, the UN in general appeared somewhat irrelevant. The UN in general, somewhat irrelevant due to two superpower conflicts. If there were some roles, that's General Assembly, not Security Council. Another dynamic that has not been mentioned yet, another dynamic during the 70s and 80s is that conflict between the UN and the US began to develop. The United States began to raise its voice, its complaints regarding the United Nations. And the General Assembly in general became very critical of the United States. So US-UN conflict began to emerge as more new members joined the United Nations. Because General Assembly became the center of third world countries. General Assembly. That's another dynamic. Now then, Cold War ends. Then we enter the post-Cold War era. Then the UN undergoes some functional changes after the Cold War ends. The role of the Security Council figured much more prominently after the Cold War. And the UN gets involved much more actively in regional conflicts. So, by the 1990s, the UN had emerged as the world's most important tool for settling international conflicts. So the UN becomes the centerpiece of international peace and security. Here's the important statistics. The last sentences, page 240, important statistics. Between 1987 and 1993, the number of Security Council resolutions increased dramatically during that time. Security Council resolutions, the number of Security Council resolutions increased dramatically, which shows these times, this period is most active involvement of the United Nations in regional conflicts and peacekeeping missions. So number of resolutions from 87, 93, from 15 to 78, number of resolutions, Security Council resolutions. And peacekeeping forces from 12,000 to 78,000. So page 241, last paragraph. Read it, important. Last paragraph, 241. So the 1990s, 2000s, the UN was born as a new institution. So the UN is in some ways just beginning to work as it was originally intended to, right? But again, I mean, there is the two-faced problem still exists, still remain, right? There was much more burden on the United Nations, but in terms of real power and resources, that's the problem. Resources. The UN was still lacking resources. So today, the UN is more important than ever, yet still in danger of failing. So in the coming few years, the UN must continue to grapple with these challenges of its evolving role in a unipolar world, the limitations of its budget, and the continuing strength of its state sovereignty. These are the challenges facing nations. And I want to add one more pillar to the United Nations. The two pillars, the traditional two pillars, or two functions. Number one, peace and security, social economic development. One more pillar that began to emerge, which is human rights pillar. These are the challenges, new challenges. UN is facing human rights challenges. More and more conflicts are human rights related. So these are not poverty problems. These are new problems, human rights problems. UN is asked to actively engage in these human rights crises, right? But to resolve human rights crisis, UN needs a lot of more money, right? Larger budget and state sovereignty problem. To resolve human rights crisis, the UN must be given more power, and the state should be stripped of more sovereignty to resolve human rights crisis. Because human rights crises occur in a situation where the government, national government, kills their own citizens, right? This is a unique situation where the government kills its own citizens. When that happens, right? When that happens, the UN must step in, right? But when the UN step in, the sovereignty gets in the way. So to get this sovereignty out of the way, we need to do more work in terms of like revising this principle, norms, sovereignty norm. Delegate more power to the United Nations, right? So not only budgetary problem, but also, right, this more fundamental problem facing the United Nations. Now, Security Council. Security Council. Page 242. Security Council, their main task is to handle peace and security issues in three different ways, three important different ways. One, the Security Council first, they define the threat. When an international crisis occurs, the Security Council is asked to define that threat. That's number one task. First, they have to define the threat. Second, they need to structure the response to such a threat in terms of resolutions, right? Things like that. There are a lot of activities within the Security Council. Once they diagnose the threat, right, they follow up with all kinds of, responses in the form of resolutions, issue resolutions, negotiations, sound out different great powers, opinions, things like that. Then number three, having issued resolutions. Number three, enforce. The Security Council enforces its resolutions. This is an important step. To achieve their goal, right? They need to have some enforcement mechanisms, like sanctions, or sometimes, attack, military attack, different enforcement mechanisms put in place. So these are the three steps the Security Council follows. Now, in terms of structure, the structure of the Security Council. Keisha Capella, the structure of the Security Council. Would you like to give us a snapshot of the structure of the Security Council? How many members there? How are they selected? How do they take turns serving? Like a two-tier structure, right? The Security Council has two-tier structure. What is it? Okay, the upper tier is permanent member tier, permanent member, much more core members, right? Great power, really powerful countries constitute the first tier. permanent member tier. How many countries? There are only 5. Only 5, not 6, not 7, just 5. Just 5. Who are these? Who are these 5 countries?
US, Britain, France, Russia, China.
Right. Yes. From the western side, you have the US, Great Britain, France. From the western side. From non-western side, you have Russia, China. Russia, China. You know how they make alliances, right? Just looking at these countries, you can guess on such and such issues how they line up, right? Mostly US and Great Britain, most times they go together, US, Great Britain. France, many cases, France don't see eye to eye with the United States. France. Although it's in the Western camp, but France see differently on many issues, particularly on the Middle Eastern issues. France, they don't see eye to eye with the United States or Great Britain, right? At least. Russia, China, yes, on many issues they go together, Russia, China, right? Sometimes they separate, sometimes. It's interesting to see how these 2 non-Western countries, Russia, China, how they behave on a global level, which is like in the Security Council, or at a regional level. Regional level like Won-Chang, as Won-Chang mentioned, regional level like you have CIS. And the Eurasian region, there is another intergovernmental organization, not only CIS but also SOC, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That's another intergovernmental organization since 1995. Russia, China, members, the same organization. Okay? Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SOC, handles Eurasian issues, Eurasian economic security issues. There, Russia, China, interesting to see how they behave. They cooperate, but also they compete. They compete. Like for instance, the August of 2008, August 2008, the hot summer, Russia invaded Georgia. Not one of state in the United States, but Georgia in former Soviet republics. Russia invaded Georgia. The issue was over Georgia they had some secessionist republic, province, okay? To suppress these secessionist movements, Russia invaded Georgia, okay? Then Russia clearly made it clear that that secessionist republic, okay, is not independent. It belongs to Georgia, okay? Then China ganged up against this Russian policy, along with Central Asian countries, right? So Russia, China, at a regional level, many cases, they go separate ways. On North Korean issues, same thing here. Northeast Asian region. How Russia, China, how they see North Korean nuclear problem differently. Sometimes they both oppose U.S. policy, but sometimes they go separate ways, right? So this is at a regional level. But here, at the global UN level, in many cases, Russia, China, they go hand in hand. Because the sole purpose of Russia and China is to oppose U.S. unilateral power. So, these are upper tier, lower tier. We have what? Non-permanent members. Non-permanent members. How many? We have 10 non-permanent members. 10 non-permanent members. So altogether we have 15 Security Council members. 15 Security Council members. Now, to get something passed through the Security Council in terms of voting procedure, to get some resolution passed through the Security Council, how many votes you need? 9 votes you need. 9 votes. You need 9 votes. But here's a trick. You need 9 votes, right? Including non-permanent members. But when even one permanent member objects, right? Then that resolution or that policy doesn't pass. It becomes that. That is what's called veto power. Only permanent member has veto power. So one vote kills resolution. Security Council resolution. That's veto power of permanent members. Only permanent members. 10 non-permanent members, they rotate. They rotate for 2-year terms. 2-year terms. Each year, 5 members changes. 5 members re-elected each year. Like table 7.1. Table 7.1. The list of non-permanent members. Here you have 2012, 10 members. Germany, Portugal, Azerbaijan, Morocco, Guatemala, Colombia, India, Pakistan, South Africa, Togo. These are non-permanent members for 2012. For 2011, Germany, Portugal, Bosnia, Lebanon, Brazil, Colombia, India, South Africa, Nigeria, Gabon. Right? These are non-permanent members, 2011. So once elected, they serve for 2 years. Okay? But each year, 5 new members. These are non-permanent members. How do they, all these 15 members, how do they meet? Do they meet regularly? No. Irregular meetings. They have irregular meetings. As issues arise. They meet as issues arise. It's a very good job, right? You stay home. Then when issues arise, you go to work. That's Security Council. Now, the Security Council reform. The Security Council, the structure of the Security Council is under attack. There is a controversy over how to reform the Security Council. The current makeup of 5 permanent, 15 non-permanent, many argue that this needs to change. 5 permanent, 10 non-permanent, this can't go on. Some changes should be made to the current structure. In a way that to include new permanent members, new permanent seats. How many new permanent seats created? That's the debate. That's the debate. Up to 9 potential candidates. There are up to 9 potential candidates for new permanent seats. 2 strongest candidates. Who should be the strongest candidates for these new permanent seats, in your opinion? If more countries are added to the Security Council, which country do you think should be added as a permanent member? Korea? Oh yeah, right. Korea should be. No? If we can reunify, right, North and South, combine to make one Korea, then I think that Korea is a strong candidate for new permanent member, right? I think that's a much more convincing case. 2 Koreas, right? We become almost 100 million population. 100 million population, we have nuclear weapons, right? In hands. How many? Maybe dozens of it, right? Thanks to Kim Jong-un. We have weapons, right? We have everything. We have people, weapons, right? But unfortunately, the strongest candidates are Germany. Germany is the strongest candidate. And Japan. And Egypt. And Brazil, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, South Africa. So Nigeria, South Africa, from the African continent, so there is a regional representation from Africa, from Southeast Asia, or South Asia, like India, right? India, Indonesia, South Asian region. Then you have Egypt from the Middle East. Then Japan from the Asia Pacific. Germany from Europe. So altogether 24 member Security Council. This is one of the reform proposals. Now then, peacekeeping forces, Friday. Peacekeeping forces, the international law, human rights, Friday.